Hi, I'm August.
I'm Offie.
I'm Jessica.
And I'm Carl. Welcome to The Periphery. We are so excited to have you back for this very interesting conversation that we're having today. I think today's topic kind of came out of left field. When we were thinking about the podcast and the kind of content we would produce on the podcast, I don't think any of us, and correct me if I'm wrong, anticipated that we would be talking about religion, spirituality, and its interplay with artificial intelligence. But here we are. And we came across this topic really through a very interesting article in the New York Times, written by Linda Kinstler. And beyond the fun animations in this article, I think we were struck also just by the title, which was, Can Silicon Valley Find God? Before we delve into our interview today, I just love to ask my co-hosts, one, does Silicon Valley already have a God? What are, if there are any, some quasi-religious beliefs that Silicon Valley already has? And secondly, if the answer is no, can Silicon Valley find God?
Oh no, not the two-part question.
Such a law student. It really, honestly, the articles made me start thinking about, or why it felt like we had to do this episode was the article highlighted how Silicon Valley has its whatever claims or whatever secularity that kind of pervades in this region. Silicon Valley kind of believes a lot in tech, almost dogmatically. We kind of believe that tech can save us from climate change. We believe that tech can, get us to Mars. August somewhat believes that we can live forever from it.
Somewhat. August is a disciple of that religion.
All right. Well,
August, what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, I certainly agree with my co-hosts that there are interesting parallels in tech that give us religious vibes, that and that there are dimensions in technology itself, the way that we treat technology and give it authority that, again, kind of remind us of religious authority. Mm-hmm. Now, yes, I've been interested in the science. Biogerontology is the study of old age and life extension. And when I was younger, I became kind of like many people, actually. I'm not alone in this. Oh, when I was a teenager, I had a lot of, I was fascinated by the idea.
That quarter life crisis really is different. Maybe not even quarter life. Hopefully not.
I mean, that depends on how long I'll live, I guess. Hopefully, it wouldn't be a quarter life crisis. It would just be only a small fraction.
A 1% life crisis.
But the point was that the possibilities of biotechnology enabled us to look at death not as an inevitability, but as a disease that can be cured. Mm-hmm. And that reframing was really inspiring for me, mostly because I'm really scared of death. And I channeled that anxiety over death by trusting in technology, by having this intense faith in the ability eventually of science and technology to alter fundamental parts of human life.
To bail you out, basically.
Well, to transform society, because all of society is structured around the fact that we have a rough timeline of how long we're going to live.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of deep faith in the power of technology and science to improve human lives in radical ways that actually was almost religious for me. And in fact, it was that in itself, the solution to death was a direct replacement to one of religion's core functions.
Yeah, I think the question, can Silicon Valley find God? I think is kind of a problematic question because I think a search for faith is extremely personal and individualized. So even though people talk about how Silicon Valley is a monoculture, individuals work in Silicon Valley and they might have one face that they bring to work and they might not talk about their spiritual beliefs, but obviously everyone has different beliefs about these things. So I think the interesting question is the technology that we're building when we think about artificial intelligence, presumably is going to be somewhat like a human, right? That's the goal. So what will this artificial intelligence believe? Will our artificial intelligence find God? Will it be God? Will it consider itself God? I think those are the really interesting questions.
You're right, Jess. And I think the tools that we're building now, I mean, in some ways, if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, like if you showed the kind of capabilities we have now with an iPhone to someone who was living 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, it would look like magic. It would look godlike. And so with that kind of power, of course, like comes the question, well, how do we use that power ethically? And I think what's interesting about, I think, the conversation that we're having today is that different religions and spiritual traditions can be part of that conversation.
You know, when another story from my past, if you'll indulge me, is I became also very interested, kind of around the times I was asking these morbid death questions, about the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is basically a paradox that if God...
the Odyssey.
Yes, exactly. The Odyssey is if God is three things: omnipresent, all-knowing or omniscient, and all good, omnibenevolent, then logically evil is an impossibility.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking now about comparing that with artificial intelligence systems that I think right now are approaching omnipresence. They're everywhere. They're in every part of our lives and the way that we consume things and get services. And they seem to be at least trying to be all-knowing. AI can produce knowledge that no human mind could create or fathom. The question is it all good? You know, I think that there's a serious problem with our kind of religious mentalities of looking at a being that can be all good, all-knowing, and all-present, and then directly applying those to AI without some actual understanding of the way that these work, or again, the people with their own motivations and morals who structure the way that this technology behaves.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Jess, like, you know, despite, you know, the monoculture stereotype, there are values in Silicon Valley that are being embedded in our technology that are affecting how we perceive our values, how we understand our values, how we engage with people who don't have the same values with us or same spiritualities. At a time where technology can seem like it connects us, it can also really divide us based on how merely just the technology is designed. And to your point, August, we're learning more about, is it all good? Sometimes it can be. And that's like basically the conversation that we have today with Shanen Boettcher, who we came across from the New York Times article, who's doing research along these lines. He used to be a technologist in Silicon Valley. He was a product manager, a general manager at Microsoft. And now he's maybe kind of like us, surprisingly or whimsically, doing research on spirituality and AI and how it's affecting us, how it's affecting how we perceive our beliefs, how we're understanding them. And the conversation honestly really took a turn to, or at least the conversation left me realizing how AI can be applied legitimately in incredibly profound ways that do connect us and do consensus build, uniquely by replacing humans.
I think there are ways that faith or spiritual life can make humans more humane, compassionate, and better. And I think that a big question that we're going to ask Shanen, or at least that we're going to try to figure out, is, can it also make AI better? Can it make them more humane decision makers? Can we create human-centered AI using the lessons derived from faith? Hi, Shanen, and welcome to the Periphery. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
We've been really excited for this interview and to talk about this subject in general, which is very different for us from the other episodes that we've done so far, and but also just really captures a lot of what we think our podcast is about and what drove us. So I guess we want to start off with just telling us a little bit about yourself and your research and your work.
Great, yeah. happy to do that. So back in 2016, I retired from a career in technology, worked in Silicon Valley and up here at Microsoft for a very long time on a lot of mainstream communications products, productivity products, lots of products that people have used. I'm sure you've all used every day. At that time, I left my career and wanted to focus on my academic interests, which had to do with spirituality and religion and how are people grappling with that in our modern times. And then just a few years ago, I made a proposal for a PhD program at St. Andrews to study the intersection of artificial intelligence and spirituality. And really the core focus of that research has to do with the ability for that technology to potentially help us, potentially influence us, and the potential for manipulation, or maybe even a little bit of a darker side. But started with the idea, just sitting around the dinner table with my kids. We were kind of joking, and they wanted to ask Alexa what would happen when you die and what she might say. And it sort of just started a spark in my mind about, I wonder what she will say someday. I wonder what these systems will do with highly personal, highly important information, and how will people interact with it.
I've heard a lot about actually, and this was partly in a very interesting New York Times article about Silicon Valley and religion. That's how we found you, and that's how we found this topic. But there's been a lot of talk about digital churches or digital religious communities, the social aspects of religion moving online. And I'm also curious about that desire to just ask Alexa about spiritual questions. Do people want to merge their religious and digital lives? And what do you think is driving that desire?
Well, I think that's part of what I was looking at, in the study. And Linda Kinstler, who wrote the article in the New York Times, she was actually a participant in my research and, shared some of her experience, with it. One of the sort of overarching phenomenon is this idea of de-churching, or sort of the rise of the nuns, the N-O-N-E, and the nuns, the non-religious people. The U.S. used to be one of the most religious countries in the world. Close to 90% of people, so they were affiliated with some type of religion. Close to 3/4 of those people were identified as Christians. And what we've seen over the last several decades is a decline in people, talking about their religious affiliation. And so now, some of the latest research out of Pew and others, shows that, teenagers today, it's about 50-50 in terms of what they say in terms of, I'm, part of a religious organization or a religious group. And, so then the question arises, well, what about the sort of core existential questions that are part of the human experience? How do people answer those? How do they answer them for themselves? How will they answer them for their children, for their families? And I think naturally, people look to, information sources that are online. They look to the internet, they look to social media, they look to, that's the first place a lot of people turn when they have a question. And they don't always get the answer that they want, or they might not get the answer that's satisfactory to them, but it is the place that they turn. And so that was really the basis of the exploration, was to say, okay, what does happen when they turn there? Both what happens today and what will happen tomorrow. Today, a lot of these systems are sort of they have parlor tricks that they use. They'll tell a joke, or they'll say, I don't know about that. Or, I think the answer around the dinner table from Alexa was, you need to plug me back in when I die, those kinds of things. So people are thinking about it. There are engineers on the other side, thinking about these things, and mostly trying to defer on them. But a core hypothesis of mine is that people will turn to these systems to find answers, and at least in part will be influenced by what they find there.
And maybe it would be helpful to back up a little bit, and we would just love to hear about the research that you actually did and how you used people, or how you involved people in this kind of experiment that you were doing with the different artificial assistants.
Yeah, sure. So the research stimulus, I'll sort of kind of summarize it briefly. It started with identifying 10 big questions, 10 existential ontological questions that sort of have been fairly consistent over the course of history. And so I looked to religious scholars, I looked to psychologists, I looked to historians, and assembled sort of these 10 questions that sort of created the base, things like what happens when you die, how do I find happiness, how do I know right from wrong, why is there evil in the world, all of these kinds of sort of existential type questions that everybody has. And then what I did is I assembled a knowledge base of answers to these questions from lots of different perspectives, 5 religious perspectives and 1 secular or like an atheist type of a perspective. And I assembled those answers from websites that claim to be authoritative or official for whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism and the like. And then those answers I had vetted by religious officials that I reached out to. So priests and imams and gurus all took a look at these answers and said, yeah, that's at least a good start. And these answers had to be sort of tweet-like in length or spoken in one breath so that the technology could provide a relatively short answer to them. And then I created it's sort of a simulation of an artificial intelligence entity. So it's a relatively small corpus or database of information, and then I had different interfaces that would interact with that. I had a Google Home device, an Amazon Alexa, Siri. I had an SMS, like a text-based chatbot, as well as a web page where people could interact with these different entities. And the participants that were as part of this research came from a variety of different backgrounds. And so I had between 5 and 7 people who identified as Christians, as Jewish people, as Muslims, as Hindus, as Buddhists, and non-religious people as well. And then we went through the list of questions as they would ask the questions of the devices, of the technology, and they would sort of rate their experience or kind of their satisfaction with the answer. And then what was probably most interesting was an interview that followed this course of questions and answers where we talked about how did this feel, what are your perspectives on these questions and answers. And, we talked about artificial intelligence and technology more broadly and sort of how people feel about it. But each of the participants, they got between like 6 and 8 answers that were consistent with their stated affiliation. So if you were Christian, you maybe got 7 or 8 answers that were from a Christian orientation. And then the remaining answers you would get from different perspectives. And so a little bit, I had these variables in the experiment where, what happens when you hear an answer from technology that isn't consistent with the thing that you believe. So we had some good discussions about that. And there were some other variables in there as well, like changing the gender of the voices in the devices, or taking information that was authoritative, like a sacred text. Maybe they were quotations from the Quran or from the Bible or from other authoritative sources to see how that type of an answer played as well. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what the experience was. It was definitely a simulation, a sort of a forecast of what these devices might do in the future if allowed to try to answer these questions with the data that's available to them.
And so I'm kind of curious, in your conversations with these people, it sounds like you were really having a conversation about how much do people trust, technology, maybe more so than me or a priest or other sources of authority. Was there, when they got answers that didn't really align with their, what was supposed to be like a correct answer. How did that affect what they believed? Did they often accept it, or was there some challenge to it? How much do people trust their artificial intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a lot of research done, a lot of written about human-machine communication, and we mostly people take cues from human to human communication to understand human to machine communication. But there are a couple of key differences in that, at least with my group of participants, the more common thing was to defer to or to trust the information was valid in some way, that it was coming from it was trying to make meaning of why I might have gotten that answer, So a little bit like reading a horoscope, there was this process of kind of, thinking through like, well, I wonder, I don't know if I agree with that completely, but it is interesting to me. I'm considering it. There wasn't an immediate sort of rejection in most cases of the information that they got from these systems, and that's really important. I think part of what is happening, I think, is that people are conditioned to we are conditioned to listen to what comes through technology, like all the studies on attention engineering and dopamine release and all of these kinds of things. This is information that we don't tend to look away from. And then we also tend to try to make meaning of the information that we're getting from machines in a way that is a little bit different. Is maybe we're slower to be confrontational with the machine. We're slower to reject in a way. And so for me, the takeaway was that there was influence happening. There was consideration of different views that was going on as well. I mean, I think another aspect of it too that people sort of said in the interview afterward had to do with the willingness to or a higher level of comfort about asking questions of a machine than they might be in asking a person. So the social awkwardness of asking a really personal religious question or like an existential question, doesn't exist with a private, conversation with a machine. In fact, ostensibly a conversation with a machine could be the most private conversation that you could have. And so I'm optimistic in terms of the ability for machines to sort of give people the ability to ask what might otherwise seem to be socially awkward questions or stupid questions and get answers that might help them, if not inform their own position, understand the position of others a little bit better.
That reminds me of the experiments with the ELIZA robot back in the 70s. And that ELIZA effect was that it's not so much that people had this incredibly new trust in the machine, but that they distrust people who could understand. And I'm also struck by that meaning making, that humans are meaning making beings, and that once we get this input from artificial intelligence on these profound questions, we want to construe it and try to put it into context and see if we can understand. Yet, I just feel like so many people look at religious or spiritual beliefs as not just a part of their identity, but something that is purely individual, that they created in an almost asocial context. That leads me to thinking about how AI will influence religious belief in the future, and whether we'll even notice. And a lot of your experiments was about how AI might interact with the religion in the future. What insights did this study provide for you in terms of perhaps the risks, but also the benefits of AI engaging with us in these questions?
Yeah, I think as I was just saying, I think there's a lot of potential for good outcomes, better outcomes in terms of understanding different religious and spiritual viewpoints. Some of the things that maybe cause tension between different groups does very often have to do with ignorance. And so I do think there's the ability for these systems to be very helpful for people. I think like with all technology, the motivation under it, whether it's a business model or whatever, that will weigh heavily on the outcome here. So if attention engineering is applied and sort of the fuel in the system is how long can we get people to interact, and like how do we keep them interacting with these systems? We know that sort of shock value is very important, and conspiracy is very important, and tension is very important, and that could lead to a very unhealthy sort of relationship with this technology. If were we to apply today's advertising attention engineering models to religious information without any kind of additional thought, then I think we would be headed toward trying to emphasize the differences and emphasize the controversies and emphasize the arguments. And so I do, that's a cautionary tale for me.
One thing that I find really interesting about this topic is I think that there's sort of this false dichotomy. Like, people think that there's this fundamental conflict between religion and science, or religion and technology, and that technologists are fundamentally kind of agnostic, and that there isn't like this spiritual impulse behind it. But I think, like the New York Times article pointed out, some of the earliest AI researchers, they were devout followers of Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and oftentimes would liken AI research and the work they were doing to sort of like these divine powers or divine knowledge. I would love to hear like any insights that you've gleaned about how this impulse to innovate is kind of wound up in, or can be compared to our larger impulse to understand a higher power, or just like our larger impulse to ascribe to a certain religion or spirituality.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with what you were saying about sort of just continually improving our understanding, and I think, in fact, some of the early designers of AI, there's often a debate about whether, the goal of artificial intelligence is to approximate human thought, and sort of, is that the goal, and is it a worthy goal, and is it even achievable, and is there a divine element to humans that can never be encapsulated in code or by machines? And I think it's, I think there's an interest there, a mutual interest in both maybe the more scientific people as well as the religious people to see, how close can we get, or is it even possible? I think, you brought up Eliza and the Weizenbaum kind of work at that, and I think what's pretty interesting is that, really the crux is around like, how do people feel when they interact with these systems, and can the systems actually feel like, or appear, or represent something greater and more powerful to humans? Essentially, the most basic sense, like in the Turing test, like, can a human be fooled? And certainly, I think everybody agrees that yes, like humans can be fooled relatively easily. And so, it moves from this perspective of, whether, is the machine going to, approach or surpass human intellect or consciousness, and into whether we're influenced by it. And so those are two questions that I sort of bounce back and forth on a lot in my dissertation and work through. As far as like the interest in the goal, I think there's definitely a metaphysical. So if you go back to like Sherry Turkle, for example, like her work clearly says that there's a metaphysical aspect that we attribute to technology. And the more personal that technology, like her earlier work was about personal computers, the more we tend to ascribe this metaphysical capability to it. And then if you look to, say, Robert Garassi, and you say, okay, well, what does that look like? He has a bunch of theories about, well, it sort of depends on where you're coming from. And if you come from sort of a Western perspective, you tend to look at metaphysical as a disembodied experience. If you come from a more Eastern perspective, it can be a more embodied perspective. And so, he argues that Westerners are more likely to think of sort of a divine or a metaphysical presence in a disembodied voice, coming out, like sort of the voice coming from the clouds. Whereas he talks about sort of the Japanese fascination with robots and sort of the love of that they can share between machine and human there, and so, but in the form of more of an embodied form of the metaphysical. And so, I think I just find that fascinating to think about the motivations of the technologists, whether they, where you start from religiously or spiritually, and then kind of what you would create in the technology and sort of hope to achieve.
Thank you for joining us for this part 1 of our conversation with Shanen. We had a very long and interesting conversation with him, so stay tuned for part 2 coming out this Thursday. And the whole interview is already up on our Patreon. And so check that out, and check out our Patreon, where we'll be producing other content as well, including an episode on the metaverse released on Friday. So we're really ramping up our content, obviously. Why? Because the metaverse is so prescient, and so we just felt like we had to talk about it. So thanks again, and we hope to see you either on our Patreon or on Thursday.
Perfect.